How can I affirm that the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans? Contention 1 is the economic problem. Rachel Matthews at Trinity University writes that white privilege has roots in racial economic inequality. Vagrancy laws, loan lending disparities, and disproportionately harmful policing policies led to a lower financial status and a poverty rate 17% above the national average. Aaron Dolly at the University of Memphis explains that because cash transfer reparations establish the wrongfulness of predicate actions, they are beneficial to ending privilege. There are two benefits. First is social progress. Martha Mahoney of the University of Miami explains that despite low levels of offenses, black people appear more violent than they are. The Pew Research Center confirms that black incarceration occurs 6 times more frequently than for whites, yet 62% of non-African Americans perceive that policing is fair because of the association between criminal activity and African American poverty. A cash transfer reduces the scapegoat of poverty, making racism more evident. Further, apologizing for a wrong is necessary to officially show that African Americans live in a uniquely disadvantaged situation and that the legacy of slavery is disproportionately harmful. Second is economic progress. William Darity of Duke explains that cash payments increase African American purchasing power. Reparation payments would provide an economic stimulus for predominantly African American communities, benefiting local businesses and expanding employment. Amy Turner of the Kellogg Foundation writes that if African American spending power was temporarily matched to Caucasian spending power, the U.S. economy would save $1.9 trillion annually from lifting millions out of poverty. Contention 2 is residential segregation. The EPI explains that the federal government is responsible for the isolation of African Americans in urban neighborhoods. Federally funded housing was racially segregated until the 60s, with later selective grant mortgage programs subsidizing the relocation of whites to suburbs while blocking similar black relocation. In the 90s, federal infrastructure projects gentrified African American communities, pushing them into worse areas. Even without legal barriers, many cannot leave their neighborhoods for financial and social reasons. U.S. Census data shows that 86.5% of African Americans live in an urban setting, creating two problems. First is healthcare. Regardless of insurance status, the CDC reports that millions of African Americans don't live near a hospital as a result of relocations. In African American neighborhoods, unsatisfactory access is devastatingly compounded by zoning laws allowing for factory pollution and uncorrected toxic infrastructure. Consequently, African Americans ingest 26% more lead than average. Even if they can make it to a hospital, the Kaiser Family Foundation furthers that many lack coverage since job opportunities near African American neighborhoods are often designed to be part-time to avoid providing benefits. Even with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, African Americans will account for a quarter of those lacking coverage. All in all, the Pew Research Center finds that these healthcare disparities kill 176,000 African Americans each year. Brunelli Randall of the University of Dayton explains that health education, establishing drug and disease treatment centers, hospitals, and providing health vouchers would constitute life-saving reparations. Second is education. Gary Orfield of UCLA explains that 73% of African American children attend predominantly black schools in low-income urban areas. This is critical because Jonathan Sandy of the University of San Diego explains that urban schools tend to be underfunded and understaffed. Funding disparities have critical implications for the black and white achievement gap, with Gloria Billing at the University of Wisconsin explaining that students in urban schools score 2 full standard deviations lower on reading and mathematics tests, while the Pew Research Center finds that African Americans are 40% less likely to attend college. Subsidized integration into suburban schools would constitute reparations. NPR reports that national busing programs halved the achievement gap from 1971 to 1988, and with fewer students attending inner city schools, the limited funding can be more concentrated to help the students who decide not to integrate. Please affirm.
Can you see the $376,000?
Yeah.
Can we just read that to
Yeah. It's possible to get my laptop back before crossing.
Before crossing?
Yeah, that'd be great. Actually,
I'll just take crap now.
$176,000.
We're starting crap now.
$176,000 black people die every year because of health disparities. I've seen the part. It's just like you just need to take the links.
Alright. Please come down.
thanks.
All three judges?
we negate and observe that, as Gary Stein writes in the Sun Sentinel, our country is on the track to racial justice in the status quo. Recent policy changes, such as the Action Plan to Reduce Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities and the expansion of the Fair Housing Act in 2015, are clear examples of this. If reparations disrupt this trend towards racial equality, you vote con. Contention 1, reparations create government complacency. If we pass reparations, the government will lose its motivation to continue to pass policies that address racial injustice for 2 reasons. First, because advocacy groups will fraction. As Glenn Lowry of Boston University explains, reparations perpetuate a narrative of racial justice that leaves out non-black minorities, implicitly denying the legitimacy of their struggle. Art Ball of St. Mary's University corroborates this, finding that reparations divide the minority community, precluding political cooperation. This is devastating because Shirley Hill of the University of Kansas explains that political cooperation between minorities is necessary to achieve racial justice in our country because it incites policy reform through collective advocacy. When we lose these groups, the government will no longer be pressured to pass progressive policy and will become complacent. Second, because the government will think its job is done. Blanks of Rare Magazine explains that the payment of reparation preemptively signals to both society and lawmaking bodies that the debt owed by the federal government has been paid. This will cause a trade-off of future reform policies because calls for equalized policy will fall on deaf ears. Ultimately, reparations prematurely resolve the issue of racial justice without truly addressing it. Contention 2, reparations create sweeping opposition. Reparations turn society against future policies that benefit minorities for 3 reasons. First, reparations incite public backlash. Passing reparations would undoubtedly anger the majority of Americans, 68% according to a YouGov poll, who are opposed to reparations. But even worse, according to Alfred Brophy at the University of Alabama, most non-blacks view reparations as a radical redistribution of wealth, which angers them even more. This is because, as Nyhan of the University of Michigan finds, when people's beliefs are contradicted, those beliefs become entrenched. As such, when opponents of reparations are angered, they will strengthen their opposition to future racial reform. That matters because politicians must appease their electorate to stay in office. Thus, politicians will stop supporting progressive policy in an attempt to keep their jobs. Second, the media will entrench racism in our society. As Van Eyck of the University of Amsterdam explains, the media in today's world does not passively report on events. Rather, it reconstructs them with a, quote, special focus on negative, conflictual, or dramatic events, and generally a white, Western, male, and middle-class perspective on news events. As such, the media's depiction of reparations would cater to the opinions held by 94% of white Americans, which YouGov finds is one of complete opposition. The media thus spreads disdain throughout society. This is crucial because Stuart Soroka of McGill University empirically finds that the media's presentation of issues has a direct impact on policy outcomes throughout the policy-making process. Thus, when the media perpetuates racist opinions, we see that mirrored in public policy. Third, reparations warp the perception of progressive programs. Hannah Brown of Wake Forest University explains that when a policy such as reparations is justified on the basis of race, the issues addressed by that policy become conflated with the issue of race in the eyes of both the public and the legislature. This is problematic because Brown finds that this A, makes further reform more difficult to pass, and B, gives politicians the opportunity to capitalize on racial tension and pass punitive policies that entrench racism in our society and government. Reparations prevent our society from truly reaching racial justice. That's why the NAACP itself proclaims, quote, our position on reparations is one of flat opposition, on both philosophic and strategic grounds, to what we have elsewhere described as an illogical, diversionary, and paltry way out for guilt-ridden whites, anxious to avoid the reality and sacrificial decisions they must make. Thank you. Please begin.
Can I see the NAACP evidence?
Sure.
Right. Can I have turn cross, or do you guys want me to?
If possible, just give us feedback as soon as possible. Okay?
Yeah, sure, but I can have turn cross.
That's fine. Right. Okay, cool. It takes a minute. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Let's just use
You still that's
Oh, yeah, sure.
okay.
Yeah, everyone ready?
Alright.
So, in your second contention, you told me that when views are challenged, they're enhanced. If that's the case, then how does the status quo solve racism?
What do you mean?
Like, if people will never get their views changed on race, then how does your framework of the status quo
So,
working?
here's how. Because in the status quo, and Ben's going to discuss this more in his rebuttal, what you see is gradual, pragmatic reform. What's different between that and reparations, which will entrench racism, is that they don't directly contradict the beliefs all at once,
So
right?
they're just gradually contradicting their beliefs? It's
Right,
like,
and
just
you-
like not
when you
notice
gradually-
that racial equality is happening?
Basically, but it's not that they don't notice racial equality is happening, it's that they don't see this radical redistribution of wealth happening all at once that Brody talks about, and that your personal
It's right to conclude, pro or con, just doesn't matter.
You tell me.
He concludes that reparations ultimately outweigh the benefits of
But
those farms.
Brophy weighs stuff differently than we're gonna weigh stuff in this round, and more
The
importantly,
problem
it
is
has,
that
he thinks of different stuff than you.
Reparations are
I don't
beneficial.
think that, I think that's right, he, there's a lot of other stuff, he is weighing out, we're putting it in different ways.
Alright, so let's just pick and choose.
So,
Do you have a question?
sure. So let's talk a little bit about residential segregation, right? Specifically, let's talk a little bit about this healthcare,
Okay.
right? So the Randall evidence, right?
University of Dayton?
No, the when?
Oh, I don't know the exact date, but I can do the card.
Like 2005-ish, right? So how does that
That's
account
not that
for
long
recent?
ago.
But how does that account for recent policy changes in the healthcare sector?
She's not talking about recent policy changes. She's saying that
Exactly.
factors in hospitals constitute
But
reparations,
here's the
and
thing,
that's all right.
right? But the fact of the matter is that when you look to what's happening in the status quo, specifically in the healthcare sector, you see recent reforms like the acting racial discrimination in healthcare.
When you look to what's happening in the status quo in healthcare, 176,000 African Americans die each year. I don't think the federal government's solution should be, oh well, I guess we'll just let the status
But
quo
here's the
solve.
thing, right? When you see that pragmatic gradual reform like the action plan, stuff that happens slowly
Why
and
should
doesn't
reform
think into
be
harms,
gradual when people are dying now?
because when it's abrupt, really bad stuff happens that can actually increase punitive policy in the future, stuff we see like the overt back in
So we should
1976.
accuse white
You see
voters
racist,
instead of saving black people's
It's
lives?
better to, what it's better to do is find a way to pass similar policies, maybe a little bit slower, that actually don't entrench racism in our society
What
and don't cause, what do you mean?
Like what policies are being passed?
Like the action plan on the ethnic and racial health discrimination in the healthcare sector, that
Okay.
these are the top of my list.
So how many
Let's move on.
lives
Do you have a
does that
question?
save? How many, that is my question. How many lives is that?
So it's really recent, so I can't give you a number on how much it's saved, but we might wait, but maybe if we wait a few years, we'll see exactly how.
Okay, I hope we'll save those lives, I guess.
So
So was there backlash for the Civil Rights Act?
it's not the same thing, the reparations, something was going on.
Was there backlash? It's a yes or no
Yeah,
question. Okay, so should we appease white voters if they're upset by reparations?
The parallel's not at all the same.
Let me run some crap.
Roadmap's a little bit strange. It's going to start out on our first observation, but I'm also going to do kind of like an overview and analysis type thing. Are we ready? Just response, essentially. Start at the top of their case. They read you this observation from a local newspaper, keep in mind, that racism is going down in the status quo. One author's opinion in a newspaper doesn't show what's actually happening in the United States. If you look to Phillips and Barber's Journal for Social Issues, he explains that racism on the whole is enhanced by colorblind policies, which is the entirety of their advocacy. At that point, the policies that Sullivan was asking him about in Crossfire won't do anything to help minorities on the whole, because we've already implemented similar reforms, and 176,000 African Americans still die each year from disparities. But secondly, more importantly, they don't show you any harm from affirming the resolution. They don't specifically tell you that any of this will happen besides the warrants that they give you in case. Historically, none of this has ever occurred. There haven't been these massive trade-offs, otherwise after Japanese American reparations, for instance, who would have seen welfare gutted completely. With that, go to their first contention, which talks about complacency. Their first warrant is talking about fracturing minority coalitions, essentially. My first response is they don't prove mutual exclusivity between giving reparations to African Americans and other reforms for these types of minorities. In fact, if you look to Lori Belfer of the University of Virginia, they explain that African Americans not being oppressed by the federal government means that they can advocate for other people and their reforms later on in the future. That's a very clear reason for you to affirm the resolution. Because African Americans share their advocacy with other people, they don't just hold it for themselves. But second and more importantly, if you look to history, this has actually happened. For instance, after Japanese American reparations, we saw the reparations movement movement for African Americans skyrocket. That's why we're having this debate in the first place, because one reparations movement inspires another, and that leads to the entire spiral effect of civil rights. But my third response is that backlash from these minority groups isn't a specific reason for you to negate the resolution, because African Americans are dying now, that's what you should weigh above all else. Second, they tell you from Jonathan Blanks of the Cato Institute that the job is going to be viewed as done. Keep in mind that the Cato Institute is an organization that disputes the existence of racism in the status quo. This organization has a very clear agenda. It's the only warrant they give you for this argument. At that point, you can negate the resolution because they're using flawed evidence. Go to their second contention, which talks about increasing opposition. They first talk about backlash from the majority. My first response comes from Benjamin Levy of the Truman College, who explains that after we implement reparations, people will be more coherent to the African-American struggle because it forces them to acknowledge the guilt of privilege. Essentially, the argument is this. People oppose reparations right now because they don't know the cost of being African-American. But Benjamin Levy tells you that reparations force them to acknowledge their privilege, and in doing so, they're an intrinsic attack on racism. But second, if you look to Kevin Hopkins of the John Marshall Law School, he explains that everybody could feasibly benefit from reparations, so even if 68% of people are opposed to them right now, that number is going to decrease as we pass them. Second, they talk about how the media is going to entrench racism. First, they don't gain any impacts from this argument whatsoever because empirically it isn't true. If you look to Melissa Michelson of the California State University at Fresno, she explains that whenever the media discusses reparations, empirically support for reparations policies actually increase because people see how biased the media is against African Americans. That's a very clear turn on this argument, because once people see that African Americans are being victimized by the media, they're more likely to support their struggle for equality. But second and more importantly, the evidence that they give you tells you that it concludes This is something that Sullivan alluded to in Crossfire. The Brophy analysis overwhelmingly concludes that reparations are a good idea. At that point, you should affirm the resolution because his weighing analysis is a beneficial way for you to look to policy. Third, look to their argument about racializing welfare. My first response is that this exists in the status quo. It doesn't get significantly worse after you pass reparations. In fact, if you look to the Department of Commerce, they explain that 38% of the people on welfare are African American, compared to 39% of the people on welfare who are Caucasian. We still associate welfare with the African American struggle. The racialization of these policies doesn't occur. As an overview of this entire contention at the bottom, where they tell you that we're going to be trading off with other policies. Obama is in the White House right now. He's going to veto any type of policy that guts welfare on the whole. There's no type of liberal who's currently in power who's actually going to let these policies happen. Finally, they tell you that the NAACP doesn't support reparations. That's just a quote from one member of the NAACP. They passed 5 different resolutions in their organization that actually support the idea of reparations in H.R. 40. Please affirm.
When you take some breath, can I see the bar that you read about race neutral policies at the top?
Yeah, great.
And then Michelson, about the media.
Yeah, for sure. My Wi-Fi's off, by the way. It's just, it might be on.
Yeah, no problem. That's fine. Interesting.
This one's a little bit nice. I get this down. Which ones did you want to see? You want to see Zimbardo?
Zimbardo, okay. And Michelson.
They're not showing now.
So,
Tell you what, we'll take those cards.
can I take the cards?
Yep.
Zimbardo from and Michelson from the
Yep.
media. So we'll take some. Yeah, we'll take some.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what's your question?
Just the Zimbardo evidence at the top. And then, what does that actually say?
Yeah.
Sure. That one's the one that says colorblind policies are bad.
The color policy bad evidence, and then also the media.
Yeah, and then the media evidence we take also.
Yeah, the media response. We're all set. So we're gonna make that. We have 8 seconds to do that.
status quo, pragmatic racial reform is actually happening. That's what Stein tells you. Furthermore, it's not just Stein, it's also Obama. So that's the top of our case, right? Things like the Fair Housing Act, Fair Sentencing Act, the action plans to reduce racial and health disparities. That's why the NAACP is opposed to reparations. That's like, even they say other people, you know, other people in the NAACP disagree with this is the logic. We have like incremental reform right now. Don't pass a huge bill that stops all that reform. So let's go over their case. First contention, they talk about this cash transfer program. First, you can look to Elizabeth Anderson, who explains that this is only temporary, it's not long-term whatsoever. This means the scapegoat of poverty decreasing is very short-term, and this economic progress is very short-term. Second, you can look to the fact that the current cut-throat policies that are in the federal government take every dollar that is put into this policy out of a policy that is currently in the government right now. That's a harm because those current policies are really, really good, and that is taking out of them. But let's move on to the third response, which is essentially that we lose welfare in the future. Welfare reforms are reenacted every year. When racism increases, we lose the ability to pass those policies in the future. That's a net harm. Move on to their second contention about residential segregation. First, remember that the status quo, so that they impact to health and education. So let's go around. First, the status quo is solving. Look at the action plan that we read at the top of our case. In the status quo, it's not perfect, but at least we're starting to solve. Second, he talks about like this big lead issue. The thing about lead is that the government has been addressing it very effectively without reparations. In the 1970s, 88% of kids had unsafe levels of lead. Now it's just 2%. So the government is addressing it. But then on $176,000 lives every year, two important insights. First, it says that this is caused by residential segregation. But nowhere in their case do they say that they're solving for residential segregation. But you can look to the Fair Housing Act, which is in the government right now, which is solving for residential segregation, and we lose the ability to pass laws like that if we pass reparations. It's in the government right now, and those types of laws won't continue to pass. But let's go on to the ways they propose solving it. First, they talk about hospitals. The government isn't really considering hospitals as reparations, so like maybe they can get an impact, but insofar as the probability is really low, then you shouldn't weigh the impact really highly. But second of all, it's not a reparation because it's not given specifically to African Americans, it's just given to communities, that's not a reparation. Then on vouchers, a few problems with vouchers. The first one is we already have Obamacare. The issue with their evidence is it's from before Obamacare, but Obamacare is solving these issues right now. But second, you can look to health vouchers, which are really, really expensive and insufficient according to Charles Doherty of Creighton University. They would cost like way, way more money than is necessary. Now let's move on to education, right? They essentially say that they're solving, the way they solve it is through busing, right? First of all, probability, is anyone trying to get reparations through busing? That's a really, really low probability. Insofar as that's true, the impact of it is really low. But second, they don't tell you how effective busing is whatsoever. At that point, you can't really weigh it. Even if education is a harm, they don't solve it. Let's move back to my case. My opponent's responses on like the Stein evidence, they say it's one author's opinion. He's citing Obama, it's also Obama's opinion, if you want to think about that. But second, they say colorblind policies fail, they don't have a warrant, they don't have a card. Let's go on to our second contention about opposition, right? In terms of backlash, first they give this levy evidence that says people don't like understand and then they acknowledge their privilege after reparations. They don't address the nine-hand evidence that says beliefs are entrenched when you're told that you're wrong. They don't address that whatsoever. People won't acknowledge their privilege. Their beliefs will get entrenched and that will create even more racism in the long term. Second, they just claim without any warrant that backlash is decreasing from reparations. Make them give you that warrant because it doesn't make any sense. If reparations are given, after white Americans who are giving those reparations are going to be like, why are you taking my money, and being very, very upset about it. That's the logical link chain. And furthermore, 68% of them already oppose it. It's going to get even worse. On to media. So they drop the Michelson card. Their only response is essentially Brophy, who says reparations are good. But the thing is, we can't just look to cards. We can't just throw cards at each other. We have to do our own weighing analysis. So even if Brophy concludes that way, it's not important. So the fact is, in the media, if we have this horrible media that is perpetuating the stereotype that Van Dyke tells you, you're going to see a big, big increase in racism. But finally, on racialization. They say that it exists right now. But the evidence specifically tells you that when we pass policies like reparations, we lose the ability to pass future policies like welfare. Ultimately, when we have this big, big increase in racism, we're A, not going to be able to solve the problems they propose, and B, the United States federal government won't be able to pass more policies like beneficial ones like the Action Plan and the Fair Housing Act. Yeah.
So, why do cutthroat policies exist?
What do you mean by cutthroat?
Can you tell us at the top of the level with cutthroat policies, like the cutthroat procedure you...
Oh, cutthroat. I read that application.
Yeah, that's fine.
Why do they exist?
Yeah.
I don't know. You tell me.
Okay, they exist because Republicans have control of the House and the Senate.
Sure.
Why can we wait until they don't to implement reparations?
Because the resolutions in the status
No, it's not. Like, in no way. Like, if I ought to do something today, I ought to do it tomorrow. Like, there's no reason
why are we
a resolution passes
why should we
reparations
debate the
today.
future? Like, think like if we could
We're
talk about
debating future impact.
because like then we could pass reparations in like
We're
200 years.
debating
But like we don't know what's
future
going to happen in 200 years. Why don't we just talk
So
about
then I
how
would
we
argue
now?
that probability matters at that point. If
you're telling me that we can't get access to any argument, basically, because, like, let's be real, if we were to, like, we wouldn't pass reparations now, with the Republican-controlled House and Senate.
But like,
By the time that we pass
pass
reparations, like, the reason that we wouldn't have these cut-and-go procedures is because, like, the leadership would be significantly different.
I mean, but you can't like prove to me that the Republicans are going to lose that House.
Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk a bit about like this $176,000 like lives per year. Because it seems like that's what you're going to extend.
76,000 lives, yeah.
That's what it seems like you're going to extend
Yeah,
on
sure.
focus, whatever, right? So the card says like it's because of residential
Yeah,
segregation,
exactly.
right? So how do you solve residential segregation?
By, like, reducing the amount of people who don't have access to a hospital.
That's not what residential segregation is.
Well, no, but it's the effect of residential segregation.
yeah.
So we don't solve.
Because of residential
Right,
segregation.
so the reason that the card says that is because people don't have access to healthcare infrastructure. If we build existing healthcare infrastructure in these neighborhoods,
Okay, how is that a reparation insofar as there's
yeah,
no
there's a
one
couple of different ways.
Okay.
So the first way is because it's addressing for a historical wrong. We give you all the history at
Sure,
the top
but
of
my
the
issue is that reparation has to go specifically
Not
to
really.
African Americans.
In fact, like, if you want Sullivan to read some topicality evidence in the next
I don't want to read
Naomi-
cards, I just want to like.
Well, like,
talk
sure,
about the
so
topic.
then let me give you the warrant.
Go for it.
So anything that restructures power in favor of African Americans should be considered a reparation
Not really.
because it's impossible to delineate effects to other people who aren't African.
Okay, I'd say that's not really true because reparations are going to be specifically to racist as we've done in the past. But my second response
So, like,
would be
your
to say
argument-
that hospitals should be passed.
So your
I mean, don't
argument-
tell me that anyone is actually trying to pass hospitals as reparations in the status quo. It seems pretty unlikely.
Your argument could be that somebody who's not black getting reparations means our entire case is not topical.
Yeah, so you should give reparations to African Americans like every other reparations program is
So
happening.
somebody who identifies as African American but isn't, for instance, could be given reparations.
I'm not saying you
in our
should
case
give
is not
feasibility,
topical.
I'm just saying that every time you've given reparations in the past, it's been specifically to people. It wasn't just like, oh, let's build some hospitals, right? That's what the federal government can
No,
do any
but
day.
our argument is that
So
it's likely
chances-
because African Americans are advocating for this type of reform. And given
According
the
to
current
who? According to
political, so sure, so like,
Just Randall, right? And she's a nurse practitioner, like one random, like.
no, I mean, like, there's a couple of other pieces of evidence, like,
What- what?
EPI tells you that the federal government has considered rectifying this dynamic. So there's a bunch
Reparations
of
through
other,
hospitals, can I see that evidence?
well, it's not reparation through hospitals, they want to
Okay.
rectify the dynamic.
I know, but then
Way
it
to
wouldn't
do
come
that is
through hospitals. Dude, it's not gonna come through hospitals.
There's a couple of different ways that it can.
Do some studying. Do some studying, man. No homework. Econ. Study for econ.
They tell you that status quo like solvency is already happening, but at the point where 176,000 African Americans die each year, it's clear that race-neutral policies aren't working. Life is the government's primary obligation to its citizens because you can't give a life back once it's taken. Go to their first contention where they talk about complacency. First of all, we can give other minorities things while reparations are happening. They don't tell you why this is exclusive. But second, pull through the University of Virginia, who tells you that black people historically advocate for others' rights once they're given reparations. At that point, we'll actually see inter-minority cohesion increase. Go to their second contention where they talk about supporting or suppressing opposition. First of all, reparations will solve the root cause of racism and allow for better discourse that can lead to less racialized violence in the long term. This comes from Levy, who tells you that we're racist because of our white guilt, and reparations force us to confront it. They read you this card that says that our beliefs are entrenched when they're contradicted, but those beliefs will be entrenched even more when we tell people that they're right. At that point, we need to admit that the government is wrong so that we can have more productive racial discourse. Their own Brophy card does the waiting for you when he tells you that reparations ultimately outweigh any kind of backlash. Finally, you can cross-apply Levy to their media argument because the media will reflect the country's popular discourse. Finally, on their third argument where they talk about like warping perceptions of successful programs, two things. One, they drop the fact that Obama will veto policies that cut welfare. And two, if the Republicans won't pass reparations now, there's no time frame, and so let's just wait. Go to our own con case where you can extend some key pieces of offense. First, on our first contention, they basically tell you that you can apply all of my other answers because they're mostly cross-applying case, but at the point where every year we have reparations, we get $1.9 trillion in an investment. Ultimately, even though people don't like reparations now, the popularity will increase once they're passed. Go to our second contention where you can be almost signing your ballot. Essentially, they tell you the government has already been addressing this poverty. Essentially, what happens is the Pew Research Center says 176,000 people die each year. At the point where black community leaders are calling for these types of reparations, that's what would be passed if we were to pass HR 40. We link you to lives, that's a prerequisite.
Is everybody ready? Okay, I'm going to start on framework and then go first. So, begin on framework. We tell you from Stein and from Obama that the status quo is being very effective with gradual pragmatic reform. The important thing about this is that this alternative is always going to be better than radical reform that happens all at once. And this is even more important because we tell you that the status quo right now is solving, right? So that means that all of their outdated evidence, like this 176,000 deaths, which is from 2000, doesn't really apply. But that said, let's go quickly into the pandemic economy. They never respond to Anderson. It tells you all the benefits are short-term. You extend that straight through, they don't access any benefit because they're all short-term, long-term ways out ways. But secondly, you can look to cut down, right? They tell you that we don't have to look to the status quo. But what else would we look to if not the status quo? It doesn't make any sense to try to implement reparations in 200 years. It's just sort of ridiculous. So we get offense there because all of this money comes out of other things like welfare. You can vote for us right there. But then secondly, on this idea of health and residential segregation, two key things with the 176,000. It says that first it's in 2000, so it doesn't account for Obamacare. It doesn't account for the discrimination action plan that was implemented just earlier this year. But secondly, and this is going to be most important, it says because of residential segregation. They never solve residential segregation. They don't link into that at all. They don't tell you that the reparations program they advocate would actually have any of the impacts they try to link into. With that said, briefly on this idea of coalitions, right? Their term thing is not responsive to our argument because we're not talking about what black people do. We're talking about what the other minorities do when they feel left out. So now, let's go to the three main reasons you have to vote for us. First, on racism. They don't respond to NIAN because when you contradict the least Americans with a radical policy all at once, you entrench that opposition. And what's really key about this is that politicians have to appease their electorate, so they go and implement racist policies and oppose for progress because the racist beliefs of the majority are entrenched. You can vote right there if you see an increase, a decrease in passenger beneficial policy, increase in harmful policy. But secondly, on the media, their only responses are cards that they couldn't give us, so you go straight to Van Dyke, who tells you that you perpetuate the views of white people throughout the media, right? So you don't actually get the public views, you get white people's views. Soroka tells you that influences public policy, you vote there. But then third, on racialization, it's not happening in the status quo because it only applies to policies that are specifically justified based on race like reparations. Thank you.
You guys get good?
Yeah.
All right. So you guys tell me that the Affordable Care Act is totally working, but when a fourth of the people not covered are black, how is that?
So we're not saying that it's perfect, right? But we're telling you that the way to get real reform is to do small incremental reform. Things like the Obamacare in 2010, we had the action plan that was just put into place this year.
But why does healthcare matter if you don't live near a hospital?
I mean, first of all, hospitals aren't going to be the way that reparations come.
You don't make that topicality response except in Crossfire.
And in rebuttal.
Well, no, not rebuttal.
If you want, the problem is that when you look at what black leaders uniformly they identify health and education as being primary
But
disparities.
like, what sort of
What's
health, do they want like
Like the
healthcare
NAACP.
vouchers, do they want like hospitals?
Yeah.
But also
sure,
hospitals,
it's
like,
access
this isn't
to
a reparation.
Yeah, this is sort of just a big thing. Do you mind if we ask a
Yeah,
question?
sure.
Alright, okay, good, Max.
Yeah, thank you.
Alright, so you tell us essentially in response to racism that there's going to be more opposition if we don't oppose what white people think, right?
Yeah.
I said we'll entrench their views further.
Okay, but the thing is, like, voting con doesn't do anything. We don't like if you vote.
Exactly.
You know, I agree. So like, you're gonna say like fast stuff, whatever. The thing is that if you vote con, you don't entrench beliefs further. They just continue the way they are now.
Which is
if you vote pro, you do entrench them,
continue
right?
to let people
Here's the
live
thing,
out
right?
racism.
But we're telling you that voting pro is even
The
worse.
status quo is gradual improvement, right? It's not like proof racism's gone. It's racism is maybe slowly eroding. Whereas the pro world is racism goes boom.
I mean,
a lot
we
of
give
the people who like you claim say that reparations
But everything is described.
are needed because the status quo is solving, like the NAACP,
We can go
for
past
instance,
people.
have passed like resolutions that say they support.
Okay, why don't we go past the like whoever people think? Let's look at
I mean, that's their own.
I mean, we like spit cards about like who says reparations good, who says reparations bad.
It's more like
But at the end of the day, it comes down to the real argumentation that's happening in this round, right?
We're telling you that Obamacare was like passed in 2010. We see those
Yeah,
acts.
but we're getting people who aren't covered.
Yeah, it's not perfect. Okay.
176,000
But here's the
people
thing,
dying.
right? The ethnic discrimination and healthcare action plan was passed just this year, right?
Yeah,
We don't know like the total impact that that's
I'm
having.
glad
We
that
should really
nurses aren't
see.
racist anymore, but people still don't live near hospitals.
Okay, but alright, what are the chances? Like, I know you can't give me a number, but like, what are the chances reparations are paid through hospitals?
Very likely.
Why?
Because like black leaders
Because
are
I guess
identifying
so.
healthcare as being a huge disparity.
But that doesn't mean
That's also the
that doesn't mean
EPI.
we're in
I
hospitals,
mean,
right?
Hispanic people say it's a huge disparity too. And like,
Definitely.
It's not exclusive.
yeah, no, that's true. But like,
So-
what are the chances we
You
do represent
say our-
Hispanics through
so-
hospitals? Like,
You say our turn is not responsive, right?
To coalitions, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the argument is that African Americans, once they stop being oppressed, advocate for the same
Right,
policies
right.
for other
It
people
doesn't-
too.
it's
So they
nothing to
won't
do with
feel
the
left out in the
argument.
long term.
Right, no, the argument we're giving you is that these other minority groups like don't want to join forces with African Americans because they feel like they've been stabbed in the back.
And then after they advocate for them, they realize that they actually weren't.
Okay, well, wait, if you look to the fact of the matter is this.
Like,
What?
use
That's
this
the fact
data.
of the matter?
Yeah.
Okay, well, like ultimately, it's not like really that important because at the end of the day, when there's more racism, these groups aren't going to get anything done in a racist society.
Yeah, obviously. Repro.
Tell you what, I'll just sign those. Everybody good to go? Sorry. Let's start out on the framework level. They tell you from one author in Obama that the status quo is improving, and they cite 2 instances in healthcare of that actually happening. Healthcare doesn't matter if people don't live near existing health infrastructure. That's our entire argument. And the Randall of the University of Dayton evidence tells you explicitly that building health infrastructure in African American neighborhoods does count as reparations because it redresses the wrong and leads to that disparate power benefit that African Americans experience. With that, also recognize that their NAACP evidence is representative of one person, when the NAACP has passed multiple resolutions that tell you that they want to tackle these types of disparities. At that point, the probability of implementing health infrastructure is incredibly high because that's what African American leaders are calling for. On their first contention about complacency, remember from the Lori Belfer evidence that Sullivan extended in summary, that overall African Americans will advocate for other minorities once they stop being oppressed. That's critical because we can help all of the other healthcare disparities that exist for all of these other people. Slow and gradual reform isn't doing it, they tell you that themselves. Second, on their backlash argument. They try to tell you that the only way we responded was with the card that I dropped, but that's not true. The Levy evidence is also another card that we responded with that tells you that we change existing media perceptions once we implement reparations. Because the public on the whole is what changes. Individuals on the whole recognize the African American struggle. That takes out all of their racism arguments. Finally, on cut and go. Remember that Obama will veto any policy that guts welfare. They don't have any impact based on the status quo, but we don't have to implement reparations today. Now you can go back to our second contention about residential segregation. Our argument here is simple. We build the health infrastructure in African American neighborhoods, and we save 176,000 lives each year. On our first contention, we tell you that the economic benefit of giving reparations is $1.9 trillion. Even if that's short term, that pays for all of the health infrastructure that we implement. That means that they don't get access to any of these trade-off procedures. Overall, you're going to be signing your ballot affirmative, because you at least risk solvency in the short term and the long term by voting for us. You only risk solvency in the long term by voting for them. At that point, I can only see an affirmative ballot.
Okay, we'll take the rest of it.
Alright, kids ready? Everyone's ready? No. Quick observation, always look to the long term. Even if they save lives right now, you always look to the long term, and what happens with racism is when the long term racism increases, you don't get policies that help African Americans in the long term. Let's go over some important things to think about. First, they talk about economic, the first contention essentially. Anderson says that's short term. Furthermore, the cut-go policy, they say like Obama won't pass it. Obama's out of office next year, so what are the chances that he'll just veto it? It's probably not true. But furthermore, the impact of that is we lose the ability to pass really beneficial policies because the money is taken away. Second, on cover, $176,000 lives is from 2000. It doesn't account for Obamacare being in place. Second of all, it's for residential segregation. They never solve residential segregation, so they don't impact. They don't get into the card. Furthermore, so vouchers are ineffective. You read that, they don't continue. All they say is hospitals. Hospitals are really unlikely, so they can get a small impact, but insofar as the probability of hospitals is really low, you don't vote for very much at all. Furthermore, it's not even reparations because it's not specifically to African Americans. In the past, we've always given specifically to one race when we give reparations. Let's go on to our points. First, and they say that African Americans will advocate for more minorities. The issue is that we give you, with our coalition's evidence, that other minorities won't want to work with African Americans as a result. They don't really prove whatsoever, so they can't win it. On the reasons we win. First, racism. Nine says it entrenches opposition. That's really, really important because they only say but there's opposition anyway. The fact is when we entrench opposition, there's even more racism in society that don't respond. Second, on media. Their only response is Levy, who says that individuals recognize they're racist and all of a sudden they're like, oh, we shouldn't be racist anymore. That's just not the way that individuals think. The fact is that Nine evidence says that it entrenches that opposition and individuals won't just recognize their faults and all of a sudden be really great people. The Van Dyke evidence says that the media is it goes for what whites think, and the result of that is the evidence that we give you that says the media directly influences policy, you get more bad policy. Finally, on racialization. Remember the evidence we gave you that says that from racialization, we will see punitive policies passed. Again, in the long term, we get punitive policies that increase racism and harm African Americans on the whole. So essentially, if you vote for them, you might get some hospitals, which could save some lives, but they don't really tell you how many. But if you vote for them, in the long term, racism increases and we don't get policies that truly address this issue like the Obamacare in the future.